welcome to the RuckTheWay podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Gabe.
We're here to walk with you on the path today. So Gabe, my friend, excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, likewise.
And I'm excited to actually hear a bit of your story today. And for those of you who'd listened to the podcast, maybe from the beginning, we're not that far into it, but as Gabe was telling his story about where he comes from and who he is, he mentioned that he is a veteran, that he served in the armed forces and went to West Point. And yeah, Gabe, I wanted to hear more about that portion of your life today, because I'm a civilian. So for me, well, first I just want to say thank you for your service. I know that's what people say on airplanes when they announce that they're
Right.
service members, but really, I mean that, because I think that what you guys do and how you do it, there's just so much about that life that I think is costly in a way that someone like me as a civilian, I just don't understand. So I was just really curious about a particular thing that I hear about the armed forces, and I'd love to hear your riff on this, is just that when you're in training and when you're on mission, when you're deployed, that the people that you are with, you form bonds with them in a way that sounds like it's pretty powerful. And then when you come, you know, away from service, when you're back in the States and you kind of re-enter civilian life, that it's different. So is that true?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, so part of my story is I didn't want to be in the military. I wasn't a kid who grew up. In fact, I grew up in a house where I think my dad, like in reacting to the Vietnam War and kind of how he viewed those events and things in the 1960s, was a pacifist and didn't believe in letting he had, have two younger brothers. So he had three sons, didn't believe in, allowing us to like play war. He didn't think like war
Wow.
and violence was something you should play, which I can get kind of appreciate and understand, but it made for kind of an awkward childhood growing up in North Carolina in the South, like where, everybody has a BB gun and like,
Yeah.
any game basically ends with, some sort of violence.
Somebody's
And
dead.
somebody's dead, and, kids, it's true. Kids will make a gun out of anything. One time my brother and I made pistols out of Scotch tape rolls that we used markers and painted black. And that was our gun. Anyway, so that was kind of my background, just to say, like, I didn't grow up in a home where like there was like any stories about the military or, that wasn't like a dream I had. But I went to West Point to play football. Um, and then what happened was I got cut from the football team, like, before the first season even started, and I was devastated because that was my only reason for being at West Point. Had nothing to do with, like, a desire to be in the military. So,
I never knew that part of your story.
yeah.
Never have heard that. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so I wanted to quit. I wanted to come home. I remember, calling home and, that was back when we had payphones on the walls. And we had like a calling card number. You dialed in a bunch of numbers and, I had to stand at parade rest. I remember, standing there with one hand behind my back and like while the guys in charge of us are like yelling at us, I'm calling home to tell them, I got cut from the team. I want to leave. And I remember my dad was like, "Well, like, it's too late to get in anywhere else, and so I think you should just stick it out for the first year." And then he's
Mm.
like, because the first year at West Point, it's like the worst, plebe year. You just get harassed endlessly, especially back then. And, he was like, "Just stick it out, and then if you survive
If you
the first
survive.
year, then you can decide, like, then you can make a rational decision. You'll know what it is that you're leaving, because right now you don't really know. You've only been there, a month or 2." And so that, as hard as it was, that made sense to me. And I decided to stay at least in that first year. And what happened over the next 9 months was what you're talking about, which is like I experienced the camaraderie of military service and just this idea of like being with other people on a mission together. And so like, that first year was just a year of difficulty and, one trial after the next, just a super immersive, painful experience, in every way imaginable, but what I learned to love about it was that you got to do it with your friends,
True.
um, and I'll never forget, probably 1,000 stories literally I could tell about camaraderie, even just in that first year, but one really sticks out. So at the end of basic training at the academy, it's like 8 or 9 weeks, of pretty hellish experience, and then there's the start of the academic year because it's a college after all, kind of. And so you transition from the basic training company that you're in to your academic company. And so you have to like move to a different barracks and you have different cadets in charge of you and things like that. And but the harassment still continues. And so harassment at West Point back in those days was you had to do what was called ping, which pinging was you had to walk with your arms straight down at your side and you had to eyes straight forward, standing up, and you had to walk, I think it was 120 paces per minute, and which means, like, super fast walking. So imagine somebody with their arms straight down, like, head straight forward, like, super fast, like, as fast as you can walk without running, and that's the way you had to go everywhere. You had to go everywhere, and you like, if you talk to an
I'm trying to
upperclassman.
picture that.
Oh, it's ridiculous, and then, they did things just to make you look even more ridiculous, like in your workout clothes, your PT gear, it was a gray T-shirt, black shorts, like very short black shorts, and then, white socks that would be hiked up, hiked all the way up, like, that's how you had to wear them and then you're pinging, you're walking around, and then, like, if an upperclassman stops you, there was 5 responses. Like, you're only allowed to give 5 responses in a conversation with an upperclassman. That's yes or no, sir, or ma'am, like, replace the sir. Yes or no, sir, no excuse, sir. Sir, I have a question, or sir, I do not understand. That was it.
That's it.
And you had to do things like you had to memorize the front page of the New York Times every morning, not verbatim, but you had to know like all the details of every article. You had to know the weather verbatim. Like you had to memorize all the meals in the mess hall every day. And you could be quizzed on any of these things at any moment throughout the day. And on top of that, you're in a rigorous like Ivy League level education. You're also doing like uh physical requirements, like we had to take boxing. And so like literally boxing was like in the middle of your day. So you'd be in, a math class and you have to ping across the cadet area, across across campus. And then you go to boxing class, you change, you literally get your head pummeled in, you leave bleeding, like you're literally like holding bloody tissues on your face as you're pinging to your next class. I mean, it was just an insane environment. So anyway, we transitioned from basic training to this academic year, and I remember we're moving in barracks. I was in Sherman Barracks, and uh, and I'm pinging, and I'm carrying, my foot locker, and I go in my room, and there's this, other cadet who's my roommate I've never met before, sitting on his trunk, and he's eating pizza, and he's like, "Hey, what's up, man?" And, and I'm like, "You got to remember, like, we've been like starved for the last 2 months." And this kid's got pizza, and I'm like so my first thing was like, "Dude, where'd you get the pizza?" And he's like, "Let me show you." And turns out this guy, his name's Kevin Bittner, ends up being one of my best friends, at the
Mm,
academy, was my roommate for 2 years. And so Kevin and I, like, leave the room, like, which leaving your room meant, exposing yourself to harassment of all
yeah.
kinds. And, like, so he's like, "I'll show you where we can go and get this pizza." And so, like, we take our life in our hands and we go up to this
For
place called
pizza.
Boodler's Pizza that's, like, behind the barracks, and we get pizza, and I feel like, "Man, this is the greatest pizza I've ever had in my life."
I
Uh, and so there was just this bond that happened over really,
mm,
like, basic things like that of, like, to get pizza, you had to risk your life, to go.
this does not sound like my college experience at all.
Yeah,
But
hopefully not.
I'm listening to you talk about kind of the difficulties and the dangers. I mean,
Yeah.
they're controlled because 'cause you're on a university campus, but what does that give you just in terms of you're talking about the bonds.
Mhm.
It seems to me like that experience, and I'm sure then when you go and you're deployed and
Yeah.
you're in real danger and real challenges that are life or death,
Yes.
that gives you something that most normal people don't get.
Yeah, there's just something I think we're, like, meant as human beings, like, we're meant to we know that we're meant for purpose, like, we're meant for important work, and we all know that somewhere deep down that, we're made to do significant things, and when those significant things are hard and difficult, like, it makes them more valuable, right? And then when you're doing something that you perceive to be significant that's, like, hard or even dangerous, and then when you do that, like, not by yourself, but, like, with others, there is this human experience that happens, at the intersection of doing hard, difficult things with others, that's, like, I think the center of what it means to be a person. Like,
Yeah.
like, we're
Mm.
made for it because we're made for that community, but we're made for purpose, and when you combine community and purpose together, you get something really, really valuable, um, and there's a lot of like a different podcast we can talk about, the tragedy of the military and, um, the things that you're asked to do. But just to stay on this topic, like just the difficult, even painful experiences with others, there's something that like does bond you, and creates like whatever the combination is, like, leads to like, relationships that you've never had before, um, because I think there's a dependence on each other that you don't get in other parts of life, where I
Right.
think, we largely feel in control or we feel independent. You don't feel that, like, I think, like, I was an infantry guy, like, when I made my way to the army, and I think, like, a fear of an infantryman, which is just a ground soldier is, like, man, one of the biggest fears is just being left alone on the battlefield,
Mm.
um, because, like, the thing that makes you feel safe, even when it's not safe, is that, you've got your buddies there
Yeah.
with you, and your buddies will never leave you. Um, and man, there's something powerful just about that. I think
Yeah.
reality and that promise, from one soldier to another.
Yeah, I love what you said there about that kind of that intersection where you recognize that, yeah, you were made for this. That intersection where there's risk and there's danger, but then there's companionship, and you realize that something in you comes alive in a way that it probably wasn't alive in other contexts. Man,
It
I'd love to hear you contrast that to what it was like to come back
Yeah.
after deployment, to re-enter kind of the civilian world and what you found there, just in terms
Yeah.
of relationships.
Yeah, and so just a little color on lots of different experiences in my almost 8 years on active duty, but, like, what you're referring to, Chris, I deployed for a one-year tour in Iraq in 2003, 2004, and for most of that time was on a combat outpost that we called, Forward Operating Base Patriots, which we were the Patriot Battalion, 2-3 Infantry out of Fort Lewis, Washington, and FOB Patriots was a tiny little compound. It was actually like a little neighborhood, for the lack of a better, term, that a special forces group had, um, taken over during the invasion, and then we had subsequently occupied, with our headquarters element, which I was a part of, and Charlie Company. So we had, roughly 100 soldiers on this little compound that had, like, maybe, like, 10 houses on a single road. There was a single ring road, and we had the Tigris River on one side, and we were surrounded, just by the city of Mosul on the other 3 sides in a pretty densely populated urban area. And, for most of that time from, like, we got there in J to that compound in January, and then in April, things got really heated, like, the insurgency started. So from April until we left the following October, we were under pretty constant, um, attack, in a combat type situation, and so there was something, in being on a little tiny compound with, like, 100 other guys, um, for that length of time, and we had a mission, that we were trying to do, but our mission honestly was just trying to stay alive,
Yeah. Wow.
was most of it, and we were packed in there, I lived in a room with 20 other guys, 20 other soldiers, we were just in bunk beds, so you're just, like, on top of each other. I mean, there was no privacy, and it was super dangerous and, claustrophobic in some ways, and so that's how I lived for that year, um and for sure, you learn to depend on each other for
Yeah.
everything. I mean, there's no sense of, like, being by yourself. I mean, you're with your buddies, and made such great friends, brothers, really, with those guys. My, uh, friends Heath and Brent, and Mark, and I mean, I can think of these guys by name, and many of them I haven't
Mm.
talked to in years, but, still think of them, as some of the closest relationships I've ever had, just because the ways that we looked out for each other, and so, living like that in that level of intensity for a year, and then, like, all of a sudden, one day it's just over, and,
Mm.
I like to
Wow.
talk about, like, I think some of the most important parts in our stories are the seams, just like on a shirt, the seam is where the fabric comes together. It's like
Yeah.
that's where a shirt becomes a shirt, and I think that's where a life becomes a life, is like it's the seam places, the places of transition in our stories that often we just gloss over, right? Like we tell these big movements of our stories or these things that we did or places that we lived, but we miss the important like transition places, and I remember that transition, like, leaving Iraq. I mean, it was a moment, where, I remember, like, our last night, and we're sitting on top of a shipping container by the airfield smoking cigars, and we're watching, the combat still happen all around us. I mean, you could see, firefights happening right outside of the wires. You could see the tracers and everything, and we're sitting there, and it was a surreal moment, and then, like, the next day, we boarded C-130s under mortar fire, like, literally, you see the mortars impacting the airfield, like, um, 200 meters, from where we were sitting, and we the plane lands, and we get on the plane, ramp comes down, we run on it, and the airfield's, like, taking fire while we're taking off, and then, they do what's called, well, they do like a fast combat takeoff, and then they fly what's called nap of the earth, which is they fly, like, right over treetop level, and they're flying an evasive maneuver because 'cause they're we're, like, taking fire actively, like, while we're leaving. In fact, the plane behind mine, actually got shot down by a missile. Fortunately, everybody lived, but it took out an engine, and they had to make an emergency landing. So that was kind of like my exit.
Yeah.
That was just this, like, surreal moment of, like, and I remember, um, I was, like, in charge of my aircraft, and so I was sitting in the cockpit with the pilots and, remember seeing, the Tigris River. We're right over the river, flying evasive maneuvers as we got out of the country, and then all of a sudden, like, they got altitude as we, got out of the combat zone, and, like, we're up in the clouds, and I'll never forget that moment of, like, sitting up there and you're at altitude, and it's just all of a sudden peaceful and calm,
Mm.
and then we land in Kuwait at the airbase there, and then a couple of days later, we get on a chartered civilian plane, and that was a weird moment of
Oh, I
having,
bet.
like, female, flight attendants, handing us candy as we were, like, getting onto this plane, and then, of course, like, getting home and seeing Janet and all. Just this crazy few days of
Mhm.
transition, um, and it's a surreal thing, and, there's an elation that happens, like, you're just so glad to be out of it, and you're still
Right.
with your buddies, like, on those flights and everything. It's the greatest moment of your life, that you can remember, But then, like, you get back and for me, when I got back, and I left my unit, within a few months, I left that unit and went to my next assignment, and I do remember, like, the loneliness
Mm,
setting in of all of a sudden, there's nobody understands your stories, there's nobody really asking your story, and to be honest, like, I wasn't in a place where I was telling my story,
yeah,
it would be 15 years before I'd even tell Janet anything about that, so there was just this loneliness that set in, um, man, once you land back home, it's just you're in it's a like a different world, and
yeah,
nobody really gets it, and so that's how I describe the coming back is, like, disconnected, lonely, sad, overwhelmed, all those sorts of things.
yeah. I'm picturing what you said about that last night sitting on the container, smoking the cigars in that place of danger, and then sort of the escape where, yeah, you said you feel the peace and the elation, and then you land back in this world that doesn't have a question to ask you about your experience, and with no one that really understands. And I'm feeling that loneliness.
Yeah, and there's something else too, there's so many complex feelings, I think, in it for soldiers, um, because there's the loneliness of just, like, you don't have the because obviously the military life is very regimented,
Yeah,
like, you do,
right.
you have to be up for physical training at a certain early in the morning, but then in my Army career, like, one of my favorite things was breakfast in the chow hall, because you get up and, you worked out together for a couple hours, and then, you'd shower up, get your uniform on, and then go to the mess hall, and you'd everybody eat breakfast together, and it was just something about, like, man, just that rhythm of life together and all the shared experience, and then boom, like, when you're in the civilian world, like, all of a sudden you're free, which is great on the one hand, but there's something you miss about that regimented life and the shared
Right.
experiences together, the community together, that's just gone, so there's that piece of it. And then there's also a lot of shame,
Mm,
um, which has took me years to figure out, like, what that was, and I think, um, shame for me came from comparison in that, like, I always felt like I shouldn't talk about my experience in the war, the military, or whatever, because, like, I always could rationalize, but there's somebody who did something more significant. There's somebody who had something more horrific happen, well, my buddy Bob, he got his finger shot off, or, this
sure.
person, like, they really went through it, and so you feel like your experience isn't worthy of talking about. And so you have on the one hand, the loss of community camaraderie, nobody really being curious. And even if they were curious, they couldn't relate or understand. And then on top of that, this layer of shame of like, yeah, but I shouldn't even talk about it anyway, even if people did want to know, because like my experience wasn't really worth talking about in the end.
And what did you find that you did with that shame? I mean, were you able to find people that you could eventually connect with to be able to express some of those things? And was it military buddies? I mean, where did you find community where you could be able to take those steps towards addressing that?
Yeah, I mean, it took years. I mean, so my default was like I didn't and maybe, Chris, like I think one of the things we wanna do with RuckTheWay is, like, we wanna help veterans, we wanna help,
Definitely.
you know, people who have had these sorts of experiences have a place, to be able to share, and where that really comes from for me is, that I didn't have that, and that I didn't find that for years and years and years, um, and it really wasn't until, I helped establish this mountain community in South Africa, and we began to try to figure out, how do you actually, like, do life together in the way of Jesus? And one of the things we realized after several years is that, like, you have to provide space for people to tell their stories. Like, there's just something about, like, life together has to be around, like, our stories. And what I realized is, as I'm leading this community, is I don't know how to do that. And so we had some friends who, are dear friends of both you and I. And this is part of our shared experience in history is these guys that like were gifted in being curious and helping draw out your story, began to ask questions, began to draw me out. And that was the beginning of it. But what I've learned about our stories, my story is that it's a spiral. Um,
Mm.
it's not even a circle, it's a spiral that goes down. And what I mean by that is like once you it's like one of those things, in the mall where you could throw a coin and it would
Oh, and it
spin around and
spins
around and
around. Yeah, yeah.
around and then go
Finally
down.
goes down. Yep.
And then
Yep.
some charity gets, all the money
Your
or
nickel.
whatever. What's that?
Your nickel.
Yeah, your nickel, right? But like that action, I think that's like when you decide, or I don't even think it's a decision. I think it's like when you're invited, which I think that's an important word. I actually think you have to be invited to tell your story. Um,
Mm,
which is an
that's good.
important part, I think, is that it's not
Right.
just that like somebody says, I need to tell my story. I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe there's somebody that has done that. That's not my experience. My experience is I was never going to tell my story.
Mhm.
I had to be invited. Um,
By
and
someone probably who which you say is a safe person who can, in some ways, hold your story.
man, that's such an important term. I think somebody that can hold your story. Yeah, somebody who's safe. Um, Because I do think for veterans, like, part of the reason that veterans don't wanna tell their stories is there's, I think culturally there's, people are in love with, like, gratuitous violence, like, they just wanna hear stories of death and adventure, and it's really pretty self-serving, like and that's not the kind of invitation I'm talking about of, like, oh, because all veterans have had somebody ask them like, "Hey, did you kill anybody?"
Mm,
Like, which is like the worst thing you could ask
worst
for so
question
many,
ever.
it's just inappropriate. But it's also self-seeking, right? Like that's not a question that is trying to help the veteran. That's a question of like, I want to be entertained. Um, and so I think you have to have somebody who is safe, who isn't self-seeking, you know, invite you to tell your story, and when they invite you, it's like throwing that nickel onto the ramp at the mall, and it's gonna spiral and then, like, now you're on this journey, and it's around and around and around, and what I've learned is that you kind of have to tell the same stories over and over and over,
Again and again
and
and
again and
again.
again, and as you tell
Yeah.
it, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
Mm,
And by
it's good.
deeper, I mean, like, your understanding of what happened, how it shaped you, what does it mean? And that's the thing is, like, human beings are meaning-making machines, and, like, we have to story is where we make meaning of experiences. And so, actually, the thing that happened isn't actually the most important thing. The most important thing is the meaning that you make out of that. Like, what have you done with that? Like,
Mhm.
how have you understood yourself and the world around you and other people as a result of that experience? And I think the way we arrive at meaning is telling stories.
I love, Gabe, that you mentioned that one of the things that you felt coming out of that experience in the military was shame.
Mhm.
For whatever reason, shame is such a powerful driving experience. And I think also, in particular with military guys, I think using the word shame can probably be fraught for someone, a veteran coming home, because it's what you don't want to feel.
Right,
You want to use words like honor and glory,
right.
thinking about your story, but we all feel shame. And just, what do you do with your shame? I think ends up shaping your future. So thinking about you coming out of that experience, feeling shame, what do you end up doing with it?
Okay.
Who are you going to share that with? Who are the brothers in the foxhole with you now, so to speak?
Yeah,
And I know you have a heart for veterans, and that RuckTheWay, that we're wanting to open up these experiences where veterans in particular can walk with like-minded brothers who can help
yeah,
hold their stories along the way and along the path, who can hold shame, something that we all feel.
yeah.
But I'd love to hear what you hope for veterans in particular, through these experiences of pilgrimages that we're planning, of walking together, what would you like to see veterans experience in this kind of thing that we're offering in Ruck the Way?
Yeah, I think what I long to offer other veterans is a place where they can belong, um, even if it's for 5 days on a on a pilgrimage hike, because it's a place of invitation, and so I long to invite those who've also experienced, the trauma of combat and war and the dissonance that happens when you leave that environment and try to figure out yourself and your life in the civilian world and the loneliness that comes with that. It is an invitation to journey, with others who are curious, and a place where you know that you're invited and you belong, and it's a place to share story and to listen to story without judgment. Um, and to do that in a place of beauty, and to do that in a way of having the shared experience that I think is very reminiscent of the best parts of the military journey. And there's something about, I think, creating a space where, rucking, like, as an infantry guy, carrying the rucksack on your back. I mean, that was our life. That was our work. And I have a lot of, like, painful memories, but a lot of great
Yeah,
memories of, like, carrying a rucksack with my friends in the woods. And I know other veterans have those same experiences. And so I think there's something about creating an experience that's similar enough to some of the shared purpose, memories, work of being a veteran with a rucksack on your back
mm,
on, on a journey with others, but seeing that transformed in a way of, like, but now we're gonna also do the deep soul work, the relational
yeah,
work that we didn't, because we were young back then, and we
right,
didn't understand ourselves, and we didn't know how to relate to each other in that way. But now we're older, and now we can create this environment where we're doing something that feels familiar, but we're doing it in a different way. And this
yeah,
time we're asking better questions. This time we're asking deeper questions. This time we're acknowledging the shame, but we're also letting go of it. And we're in this place without judgment, and we're not going to
mm,
judge each other. It's going to be the no shame zone, you
I
know?
love it.
And I think I long to create those places, because I think even in 3 days or 5 days or whatever, it can change your life,
Yeah, for sure.
you know?
No, I love that. I love your heart, and I think what excites me about this as a civilian guy coming in is I'm longing to experience you and that side of you as a veteran that I only get to see little glimpses of, but with other vets as you were interacting with them. Because, we all carry weight in our rucksack, so to speak. But
That's
I
right.
know that a lot of veterans carry very particular kinds of weight. That, as you said, it took you, what, 15 years to even start addressing some of these things. I know that there are guys out there that haven't really addressed some of the deep stuff, the things they've experienced and seen or done, that it's weight in their rucksack that they're carrying. Um, so I'm excited to see what God does in that, but also how you interact with that, with these guys, and then what I can learn along the way from all of you. That excites me.
Well, and Chris, you're great. You asked me a question like, where was it or who was it that I could, like, process my story with? And I mean, but I'm to say it here in this public space, like, you've been one of my
Mm,
best journeying partners in my whole life. And I think even though, like, you don't have that experience, your unique capacity to be curious and to be kind and, open in those sorts of conversations has been, like, one of the most life-giving friendships I've ever had. And so I'm
oh, man,
excited
thanks.
to bring other veterans in, on a journey with you because of what you offer, just by who you are.
Well,
Um,
thanks, man.
and I wanna encourage other people too that might be listening who aren't veterans, just to go, "Well, I don't have those same experiences. How can I help?" Like, I think, and this isn't just for veterans, this is for humans, but we're talking about
Humans.
veterans today.
Yeah.
But the reality is we all have trauma, right? We all carry shame, we all carry heavy things. But I think, like, particularly for veterans, like, there's people don't know, like, they're afraid, like, I don't know what to ask or whatever, and I think, like, just being curious in a non-self-serving way of, like, "Hey, what's your story?" And then giving space to listen. Um, Man, there's something just really beautiful and
Powerful.
huge and powerful about that. And that'd be my encouragement to all of us is like, man, keep getting curious, keep
Get
holding
curious.
space, keep creating space without judgment where people can be real, because that's the way
Yeah.
that, begin to understand ourselves.
That's a great invitation. And that's something we can all do, veteran or not, is to be curious and to ask someone about their story and really be interested to hear what they say.
Yeah,
Not just use it as a springboard for your own story, but
right.
to become the kind of person that can hold someone else's story well. That's really powerful.
It's pretty big.
Yeah. Well, thank you, my friend. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for opening up a piece of your story today that I know is important. It's an important part of who you are, and it's an important part of what we together at Ruck the Way want to offer. Is a space where people can tell their stories and to have their stories held with compassion and curiosity. So, if you want to go on a journey, a pilgrimage that involves those kind of things where people are going to be curious and where you have a chance to be curious too, we invite you to check out our website. We've got 2 pilgrimages coming up in May and June of 2026. We'd love to have you come along. Spaces are limited, so there's ways that you can sign up on the website. But again, thank you, Gabe. Thanks for your heart. Thanks for your sharing today. And as we always say on Ruck the Way, let the walk
Do the work.
see you next time.